In San Jose and 59 degrees in downtown San Francisco.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Savage, Hot Talk 560 KSFO. We're talking about what kind of world do you want to live in? What highway are we on? Do we want to be on this highway? We want to create a new highway? What did Plato say? This guy knew what was going on, but that was Greece. This is San Francisco.
Is that the idea? To keep talking until finally we get it right? We're having the same conversations Plato and his friends had back in 400 BC.
Oh, did you see in the paper the other day about that high school student who was caught cheating on her college boards?
Oh, yeah, I read that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. She said her teacher gave her the answers and told her that everyone cheats. That's the way the world works.
But I think it's sad. People are under a lot of pressure.
Let's face it here. If you were guaranteed that no one would find out, wouldn't you cheat?
Would you cheat? Would you? What if there was a world where nobody cheated and philosophers were the kings? This is a book that pulls you in, plays with your mind, and dares you to put it down without saying what you think.
Plato's Republic has the kind of power to intrigue and infuriate that few works can equal. You can argue about anything, from whether we should allow certain kinds of music to be sold, whether we should censor the arts.
What is justice?
What is a great society? What ought it be?
What is authentic and what is fake?
How one has knowledge.
What do we teach the young?
Whatever it is, it's somewhere in Plato.
Plato's Republic follows the intellectual adventures of Socrates, who one night, 24 centuries ago, created an ideal city, the Republic, where all of mankind's problems are solved.
This book, the Plato's Republic, changed my life.
William Bennett, former Secretary of Education of the United States, says it encouraged him to go into politics.
Plato says, yeah, we better have censorship in the ideal republic because you're going to have, otherwise you're going to have license. Everyone's going to do what they see on the videotape, and the videotape didn't even exist. He said he would kick out the poets, too. Go up to North Beach. I tend to agree with him.
Mike Savage, a radio talk show host who bills himself as the compassionate conservative, reads it regularly to his listeners.
It's sort of an internal chess game that I play with myself. And I will read a few pages and find my mind for, let's say, the pieces of thoughts that dance around in my head sometimes that get out of control, fall in place. It's a way of ordering my mind, my imagination, and all of my mental faculties.
Nobel Prize-winning poet Joseph Brodsky dismisses it.
There are people and people, you see, and this is what Plato couldn't understand. He thought that all people should be like, well, let's say himself.
Novelist Joyce Carol Oates questions his sanity.
The Platonic vision is basically somewhat unreal. It's basically mad.
Madman? Visionary? Plato has been hailed as the father of philosophy, the first feminist, a dangerously naive idealist, and a fascist. The fact is, we know very little about him or what he meant by his greatest book.
It was indeed a kind of thought experiment to show the impossibility, precisely, of a perfectly just, perfectly communal, perfectly rational society. What the limits are, the limits that are rooted in our human nature.
I think it's the deepest challenge against our way of life that there has ever been, and a deep challenge because it has a kind of great nobility and beauty to it.
Plato was born in a place that worshipped beauty and knowledge, Athens, 428 years before the birth of Christ. The newly completed Parthenon towered over the city, one of the crowning achievements of the world's first democracy. This was the Golden Age, where the first plays were performed and the first histories of the world were written. A time when the Athenians produced art and ideas that we still marvel at. But it was also a time of devastating human loss. For the first 23 years of Plato's life, the Peloponnesian War raged between Athens and its neighbor Sparta. Plato watched as the Athenian democracy was overthrown by aristocrats, then replaced by dictators before democracy seized control once again. The one constant through it all, in Plato's view, seemed to be corruption, brutality, and blind ambition. Still, he probably would have ended up in politics like the rest of his wealthy family if he hadn't met a sidewalk philosopher named Socrates.
Socrates seems to have stood out in absolutely every possible way. He said that he was to Athens what a gadfly is to a large, lazy horse, and that the gods had sent him there to prick Athens and to irritate it and to make it think seriously about the kind of life that its citizens were leading. He was there to make people uncomfortable.
Ever since this scum set up shop here, he's made me work twice as hard.
So you say Simmias here is your enemy because he makes you work harder than you did before?
Wasn't that enough to make any man your enemy?
But an enemy is a man who does you evil, isn't he?
Any fool knows that.
And a friend is one who does you good.
Any fool knows that too.
But what a fool does not know is what is good and what is evil. Now, you make better vases and you work harder because of Simmias' competition. Do you not?
To talk to Socrates was to be taken down the garden path, at the end of which one finds that, alas, you don't know what you're talking about. So it's fun to read the works. You sympathize with the person Socrates is questioning. And you have a sense that this poor person is being had, but you don't know exactly how it's being done. Socrates is the master of this. He can give you enough rope to hang yourself, and he always does.
The master wrote nothing himself. We know him through writers like the general, Xenophon, and the comic poet Aristophanes, who lampoon Socrates as the proprietor of a thinking shop.
Anger.
I told you once, Simmias, and I won't
Anger
tell you again.
always interests me. Protagoras?
But the infamous Socratic method was captured most vividly by Plato in a series of imaginary conversations known as the dialogues. He made his mentor the main character of more than 20 books, including The Republic. The action begins at the port of Piraeus, just outside Athens. Socrates bumps into an old friend who invites him home to a party. It's there that he seizes the occasion to start a conversation that will last all night.
Kephalus, it's clear that you're a good and decent man, so if anybody knows what it means to be a good and just person, it's you.
I have been able to proceed through life with a clear conscience. I haven't been tempted to cheat or deceive someone to survive. I pay my bills. Occasionally, I give to a good cause.
So, if I understand you, Kephalus, to be a good person means to tell the truth and to pay your debts.
Well, Socrates...
The main argument of the Republic is an argument about being a good person. The term that's usually used in translations is justice, and what's at stake is a definition of justice.
The style of the book, like the Johnny Carson show. Here we are, we're gathered together, we're talking. Let's meet so-and-so. Let's see what he has to say. Let's meet Cephalus. Well, Cephalus, come on out and tell us what you think about things. Well, Polemarchus, come on out. What do you think? Well, here's that crazy guy, Thrasymachus. Come on out, Thrasymachus. What do you think it is? Well, it's like an ongoing, late-night TV show with these, quote, experts coming on. Here's your interviewer, your moderator, who says, well, that won't do. No, that idea of justice won't do, and this idea. And and the audience gets caught up in it.
A man has lent you a weapon and now wants to have it back, but in the meanwhile, he believes his wife's having an affair with someone else, and he's desperate and actually wants to kill himself. Would it be right to give him what is rightfully his?
No, I suppose not.
So, in this case, doing the right thing would, in fact, be doing the wrong thing.
It's perfectly obvious that everyone is just doing what is in their best interests. The reality is that justice in this day and age is what is in the interest of the stronger party. As a matter of fact, I'll take it even further. The advantage goes to the unjust person every single time.
See if I understand you.
At this point in the story, Socrates smashes the theory that might makes right. But back in Athens, might smashed right. The leaders of the shaky democracy had only recently lost the Peloponnesian War. They were tired of being stung by Socrates' sharp tongue. In 399 BC, the 69-year-old philosopher was brought to trial for undermining the system.
The official charge was that he did not believe in the gods of the city and that he corrupted the young. He showed you how to find holes in what other people believed, but didn't necessarily, in fact never, substitute something positive in its place. And that was seen as a very dangerous thing, which in fact it was. After all, Plato, his greatest disciple, was also the greatest critic Athens has ever had.
Socrates' trial was attended by half of Athens, including Plato. He says Socrates was offered his freedom if he would just stop questioning people. But he refused, proclaiming that the unexamined life was not worth living. Found guilty by a jury of 500, he suggested he be sentenced to free meals at City Hall for the rest of his life. They didn't laugh. He was condemned to die by drinking a poison made from the hemlock plant. Plato's account of the death of Socrates made him a symbol of free speech and a favorite subject for artists like Jacques-Louis David.
His friends come to say goodbye to him, and he spends the whole day trying to convince them that the soul is immortal, and that after he dies, the soul, which is the most valuable part of the human being, is going to remain perfectly unharmed. Socrates takes the poison and starts drinking it and continues discussing the issues. The executioner says, please don't do that, because if you get agitated and you talk too much, the poison doesn't work so quickly. Socrates says, now leave me alone, he says. Leave us alone, my good man. Your job is to give the poison as many times as it takes to kill me. My job is to have a discussion for as long as I can. He insisted on talking until the very, very end. Plato closes the dialogue by describing him as the best, the wisest, and the most just man of all we knew at that time.
The martyrdom of Socrates made a political career unthinkable for Plato. He spent the rest of his life carrying on his teacher's work. Nobody knows for sure where Socrates' ideas leave off and Plato's begin. Over time, the two names have become interchangeable. It is as Socrates that Plato plans a new world, where wisdom, not power, rules. And it is Socrates who explains why philosophers must be its kings. Until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and the power of philosophy, and political greatness and wisdom meet in one, our cities will never have rest from their evils. No, nor the human race. Back at the party, Socrates has turned into the dinner guest from hell. The rest of the company has been drawn into the debate.
You want me to prove that virtue is its own reward?
But you have to prove that the good and honest person who goes unrewarded and unrecognized comes out ahead in the end.
You're on. We'll begin with a very simple society with men and women leading very basic lives, living close to the...
And so Socrates begins to fantasize the first utopia in Western literature. Perhaps they can find that good person with the best life here, he reasons. For after all, society is just the soul writ large.
He originally creates the city as a device in order to understand something about human beings. He wants to say that each of us is made up of three parts. There's a rational part, there's an emotional part that loves honor and gets angry and so on, and then there's what he calls the appetitive part, which is the part that wants food and drink and sex and so on, the bodily appetites.
Those animal appetites must be kept in their cages, Reason and honor will rule the republic, just like the well-ordered soul. Everybody gets one job for life and a color-coded class. Bronze for workers, merchants, and artisans. Silver for police and soldiers. And pure gold, naturally, for the philosopher kings.
See, he said that there's three types of people: the gold person, the silver person, etc. Now you may say, oh my God, that means some people are not as good as others. Well, let me ask you something.
Who's to determine what class they get into?
It's real simple. I could never be a linebacker. I said that yesterday on the 49ers. But don't let me sit and listen to somebody tell me every 49er is capable of being a poet or a philosopher.
Right.
We're not all equal.
In Plato's Republic, the philosopher kings would much prefer to be off thinking, but duty requires them to rule the state. Eternal bonding is forbidden. It might detract from loyalty to the state. Mothers care for babies, but they aren't told which ones are their own. A child's place is determined not by sex or race, but purely by intelligence. A farmer's daughter might become a philosopher queen.
He does imagine that there will be some women all the way up to the top class. If then we use the women for the same ends as the men, we must teach them the same things. Yes, the males received an education consisting of literature and athletics. Yes, then we should give these two sorts of training to the women too, and military training also, and we should treat them in the same way.
Readers in Plato's time probably greeted this with astonishment. Athenian women had no vote and virtually no education. Often they weren't even the sexual partners of choice. Wives didn't eat at the same table as their husbands, let alone fight beside them at war.
It's a world in which men and women are completely equalized on the premise that women must never again be mothers. So I think what Plato means to say is this is what it would take to really overcome sexual differentiation and hierarchy.
Was the Republic meant as a straightforward blueprint or a political satire, as many scholars insist? Maybe some of both.
There is the sense that in his city I would not be able to do what I liked. There is a sense in which I would not be able to have my own family in his city. Those are very, very frightening ideas. On the other hand, there is this incredible love of learning, of understanding, of trying to fit all the various pieces of our lives and of the world together in such a way that they, even for one moment, make sense to us. This is such a powerful idea that there are moments when you say, even if the price is the other, it might be worth paying.
Plato doesn't want the rulers fighting over money or personal relationships, so he doesn't give them any. The rest are allowed the comforts of their own homes and families, but have no say in how things are run. Those who have can't rule. Those who rule can't have. It's an interesting idea. To keep up the quality of the flock, the philosopher kings secretly rig periodic mating lotteries to produce the best possible offspring. Once the children are born, the society begins shaping their characters, early and carefully.
Shall we just carelessly allow children to hear any casual tales which may be devised by casual persons, and to receive into their minds ideas for the most part the very opposite of those which we should wish them to have when they are grown up? We cannot.
William Bennett's collection of stories, The Book of Virtues, starts with that quote from the Republic.
There's really only one fundamental political question, and that is the education of the young. It's a very Platonic thought. I mean, I think anyone would agree. What do we tell them about ethics? What do we tell them about jobs, life, career, destiny, fate? Isn't that what determines the future of this country, education? And that is essentially what he's saying in this book, that the whole course of a city-state and the whole course of a life depends upon education.
To ensure that the Republic remains on course, the children are only allowed to hear heroic and uplifting tales.
Why does he look mad?
Homer's stories about the gods' temper tantrums and carousing with humans are out. So is rowdy music. Socrates decrees that any poet who refuses to produce politically correct fairy tales will be banished from the kingdom.
The first thing will be to establish a censorship of the writers of fiction and let the censors receive any tale of fiction which is good and reject the bad. And we will desire mothers and nurses to tell their children the authorized ones only. Well, this is just the very spirit of the dictator.
Censoring storytelling in ancient Athens would be like censoring TV in our own culture. The tragic plays of Sophocles and Aeschylus were the free press of their day. And Homer, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, was read as a guide to life and revered as a god. Plato thought that was unhealthy. As he puts it in the Republic, good role models don't make good theater. He doubted whether average citizens could separate reality from fantasy and worried that they might imitate the world they saw on the stage.
And he said, if amusements become lawless and the used themselves become lawless, they can never grow up into well-conducted and virtuous citizens.
Who is to give the guidance that's most authoritative in life? Is it to be the philosopher, which includes the scientist, the man of reason? Or is it to be the poet, the person or man of inspiration, of the gods, of revelation, of mystery? And Socrates' insistence is the poets need finally to bow to reason. That would be one of the great costs of a perfectly just society. If you're going to say everyone must be brothers and sisters, don't expect Shakespeare or Goethe or Aristophanes to be part of it.
From my window at dusk, I would watch the horde of bleating automobiles as they flashed back and forth past shapely nude columns in Doric hairdos, standing pale and unrebellious on the steps of the city court.
For the late Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, this is no theoretical discussion. He lived in Plato's Republic, Soviet style. Jailed 4 times, he was finally exiled as a social parasite.
There was a certain poetry that was allowed in the city, well, and a certain poetry which wasn't. As simple as that. The state was simply doing the discerning job, which is essentially a very Platonic idea in the sense, because what it does, it simply subordinates aesthetics to the ethics. Well, this is exactly what Plato is all about, and this is garbage. Well, aesthetic is, how should I put it to you? Aesthetics is the mother of ethics, not the other way around. No matter how ethical society you can build, well, it won't secure the masterpiece. Good ethics don't.
Plato thought reason should rule in his republic. We think he pushed it a little too far. We would reject the eugenics, we would reject the imposition of order, we would reject the censorship. No, there's too much totalitarianism here. There's too much utopian totalitarianism. There's too much tyranny. There's too much the smart guys know best.
When he gets to the point of saying you shouldn't love your children, we should structure the city in such a way that we don't even know who our own children are so that we won't have these intense personal attachments. You can't run a city that way, because if people don't love their own, then they're not going to care about anything else either.
The vision of the Republic is a vision of justice and harmony. Well, people are not going to be harmonious because people are going to insist upon, in the face of all these laws, committing adultery. They're going to have romantic liaisons. Children are not going to want to be taken from their mothers. Mothers are going to love their children. Somebody is going to want to create music. Everybody is born with a specific spiritual identity, and we're not worker ants. I'm not sure that ants are happy. I really wouldn't want to be an ant to find out.
I don't think any serious person could agree with that the Republic is really a good place to live in, and I doubt very much whether Socrates or Plato did. The Republic is meant by Plato to prove that philosophers can never be kings, and that we can never have a completely communistic society. It establishes the limits of politics, I think, more clearly and more profoundly than any thinker ever has, precisely by pressing those limits in this fantastic thought experiment.
My own view is that he believed it. He believed every word of it, and he never had a doubt that if his city was installed, it would be the best city in the world.
Well, that's why we go to wise men and experts, isn't it? To clear things like this up. Is this a real mountain? Plato didn't think so. What about those clouds? This flower? That bee? He said they're just copies, that there's a parallel world where you'll find the ideal cloud, the original flower, the perfect bee. The soul is imprinted with these models at conception. That's how we recognize a tree, for instance, when we see one. For Plato, the idea of a tree that you hold in your mind is what's real. This particular tree, and all the others we see, are just imitations of that idea.
Plato's theory of forms is an effort to explain what's true in an absolute sense. What is it possible to know, really? Answer: what doesn't change. When you learn geometry, you're not learning about chalk circles. You're not learning about circles that are even more perfect than the one I've drawn, if in fact the circle is made of something physical. You're learning about an ideal circle, one that you can't touch, one that you can't even see, because any circle you could see would be a physical circle. And so Plato, wanting to point us to what can't change and is perfect, wants us to consider a circle that can't be seen.
What do we see about the 3 yellow and the 2 green? What do we see?
Mathematicians proving the existence of invisible circles and abstract equations all deal with ideal forms. But the kind of mental leap Plato was talking about went way beyond math, and that's frustrated philosophers for centuries. On file in that metaphysical heaven were perfect examples of everything in the universe, even qualities like beauty, justice, and goodness. Today, wise men and women say he was looking in the wrong direction. For them, our world, this minute, is as real as it gets.
These ideas will always be evolving so long as we are human and so long as consciousness is evolving. You simply can't stop history. You see, everything is changing. Reality is flux.
Whatever you think of Plato's quest for permanent answers, nobody denies the power of the Republic's most famous story, the allegory of the cave. Imagine that this is the only world you've ever known. For as long as you can remember, you've been chained here, in this cave, watching the shadows dance on the wall in front of you. Unable to even turn around, you have no idea that they are merely reflections cast by the outside world. You believe they are all there is to life. This is your reality. Then one day, a prisoner breaks loose. Drawn to the light, he is almost blinded by his first sight of the sun. But little by little, he is able to open his eyes and see the world beyond the cave.
We are prisoners right now. We are now in the middle of a cave. Don't think of a dark room in which we are all tied up. This is the cave. The freest moments that we have for Plato are moments of imprisonment, are moments of slavery.
We all begin, in some sense, as prisoners of our culture, or our religion, or our civilization. We're given answers to the most fundamental questions. What is love? What's a good family? Who is God? Nowadays, the currently fashionable, conventional philosophy that's taught in our schools is something called pragmatism. The idea being that we just simply can't really transcend our own time and culture, that we have to just deal with the world that's given to us. Now, Plato would say that means just rearranging the shadows on the walls of our cave.
One of the tasks of the Republic is to bring people out of the cave where they're not looking at shadows, but looking at the real thing, out into the sun. If there's a cave today and shadows that people are looking at, it is the sort of darkened living room at 4 in the afternoon with those images flickering across the screen, miseducating the young.
Are his fellow prisoners thrilled to learn that the real world is out there? Not exactly. Plato ends the story by saying that they would tear the enlightened one limb from limb if they could break their chains. He has challenged everything they believe in. Of course, once you've seen the light, it's hard to go back. As Socrates discovered, it's a lonely job being the bearer of new ideas. The most damning criticism of the Republic came in the 1940s. Philosopher Karl Popper charged that Plato had opened the door for this madness with the eugenically superior model state he had envisioned in 386 BC.
People do think of Plato as a fascist, as maybe the first fascist, maybe as the greatest fascist. I think it's extraordinarily unfair and inaccurate to think of him in those terms. He does not believe in any kind of racial superiority of the people in his city. He does not believe that this society can come about by, as it were, forcible means.
The idea that Plato foreshadows certain ideas that we come to associate with fascism, let's see, I think that's fairly tenable. If Plato had never lived, however, we would still have had Hitler. One certainly can't blame Plato for Hitler or Stalin or Marx or Lenin. It's not for their theories that they're remembered, but for their actions. They were brutal murderers.
Corruption is the human norm. And this is what Plato wouldn't swallow.
Plato's understanding of human nature might appear to be as abstract as his ideas, but some of those ideas are still very much alive. For instance, in Singapore, in just 30 years, this small, ethnically diverse island has been transformed into one nation, one people, one Singapore. Led by a benevolent despot named Lee Kuan Yew, whose reputation for integrity is as legendary as his strict controls, the crime rate is down, the standard of living is up. It's seen as one of the most astonishing success stories in the developing world, and is a nation in a straitjacket.
He has curtailed individual freedoms and put into place a highly moralistic and constraining conception, which includes a lot of policies for breeding, eugenic policies, which say that we'll give special breaks to people in certain classes when they reproduce, but will penalize reproduction in some of the other ethnic groups. All of this with a kind of Platonic idea that in this way we're going to promote the common good and raise people's well-being.
It's Hot Talk 560 KSFO.
A quote from another political scientist, Ben Franklin. He said, people who are willing to sacrifice freedom in exchange for security will receive neither.
Yes,
neither.
I love that. That's very beautiful. So you're saying, how do we make America an orderly state without making it overly orderly and turn it into a Singapore where a piece of chewing gum on the street is an offense for $500, for example? I don't want to live in this Huxley and Brave New World. Okay? So I think maybe Plato's Republic can also warn us away from an overly ordered state, an overly clean place, an overly good place.
Time to take out the trash and clean out the barn.
That brings us to democracy. Could a philosopher king survive in Washington, D.C.?
On the one hand, it's wonderful that anyone can grow up to be president. On the other hand, it's frightening that anyone can grow up to be president.
America doesn't choose its leaders by lot as ancient Athens did. It holds popularity contests instead. Plato might well have admired the idea of a small group of wise men and women seeking justice in the courts, but he'd most likely see America's obsession with individual power, money, and success as signs of a society with a seriously disordered soul.
One of the serious criticisms Plato addresses to democracy is that its love of freedom easily becomes a love of license without realizing it, that a taste for having no restrictions can easily replace the more thoughtful and mature conception of freedom, which is freedom has to be freedom under the rule of law.
I mean, can we admit that our public life is disordered in something like the way Plato says, and yet still defend our own way of life? What can the role of reason be in a democracy like ours without taking away the freedoms that we all cherish?
The citizens of the Republic are satisfied with their place in life because they've been told that the gods created them for different purposes. That's why they made some people with gold in their veins, some with silver, and some with bronze. In the book, Socrates calls the story the noble lie.
We too have our myths, our noble lies, the Declaration of Independence. Prior to a probing philosophical analysis, which very few people undertake, it really comes to us and is taught to us when we're young as a kind of myth, a kind of poetry, a kind of beautiful belief. And what the philosopher in our society, if he was a Socratic, would have to do is question it, doubt it, ask, what do we mean by human rights? Do they exist?
The Republic was Plato's ultimate attempt to vindicate Socrates' way of life. In the allegory of the cave, he says that the escaped prisoner cannot sit alone forever under the sky of ideas. It is the philosopher's job to return to the cave and to try gradually to turn others away from the shadows.
The deep insight into human beings here is that we are political creatures, that the life of the city and our lives are inextricably entwined. That probably explains why I'm engaged, personally, so much engaged in public life and politics. I am persuaded by Plato that the man who lives away from the affairs of the city-state is the idiot, that to separate oneself from the life of the community is to separate out oneself from life itself.
Plato wasn't just someone who lectured and wrote. He was someone who started a school. His school was called the Academy. The word we have now, academy, and likewise the word academics, comes from the Greek word. And at his school, he had a student who went on to become rather famous in his own right. His name was Aristotle.
Aristotle arrived at the Academy when he was 17. He spent the next 20 years arguing with Plato about the meaning of it all, before he went on to tutor Alexander the Great. The world's first university lasted for almost 1,000 years. Then, in 529 AD, the Christians targeted this early think tank as a pagan stronghold and shut it down forever. Today, there's not much left of Plato's Academy, but it is still hallowed ground for those lovers of wisdom who gather each week to listen to the ideas of modern philosophers. When the school was closed, the Academy's students fled, probably taking Plato's and Aristotle's manuscripts with them for safekeeping.
It meant that there were scattered all around the Mediterranean world extremely good copies of all of Plato's works. And this meant that the odds that they would last through the Dark Ages and be rediscovered in cellars and in wine casks and all kinds of crazy places was much greater than, for example, poor Sophocles or poor Euripides, most of whose plays were lost, and so on.
Socrates survived the Dark Ages thanks to Islamic scholars. They translated Plato into Arabic and passed his books through Egypt, India, Persia, and Spain. It wasn't until centuries later that the ancient texts were finally unearthed in Europe and translated into Latin and other languages. This 9th century manuscript found in Constantinople was purchased by King Henry IV of France towards the end of the 16th century. It is believed to be the oldest surviving copy of the Republic in the world. In the 24th century since it was written, Plato's Republic has sired hundreds of imaginary worlds. In 1516, Sir Thomas More named the mythical kingdom he modeled on Plato Utopia. In Greek, it means both no place and good place. Sigmund Freud studied Plato. The inventor of psychiatry divided the human psyche into the id, the ego, and the superego, an intriguing resemblance to Plato's balance of reason, honor, and passion in the well-ordered human soul.
That idea that the person is the soul or the mind, and that the body is somehow external and temporary, a bit like a house in which you might live, has been a very prominent idea in the history of Western civilization. Of course, it has obvious connections with the immortality of the soul in Christianity.
The German philosopher Nietzsche called Christianity Plato for the people. Poet Percy Bysshe Shelley called Plato one of his gods. Even Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, pays tribute when Dr. Watson quotes Plato to describe his detective friend as the best and wisest man I have ever known.
Allow me to congratulate you on a brilliant bit of deduction.
Plato never gave up searching for the truth, and one must never let it be said that his views were impervious to experience. His one venture into politics was on the island of Sicily, where he had hoped to turn the young ruler into a flesh-and-blood philosopher king. His pupil, however, soon grew bored with the experiment and tried to sell Plato into slavery. After barely escaping with his life, Plato felt compelled to create a somewhat more user-friendly utopia. The poets still are banished, but the philosopher kings have been replaced by the vote and a set of laws. Plato died shortly after finishing the laws at the age of 80. His biographer reported he had passed to that city-state which he planned for himself and planted in the sky. Many centuries later, philosopher Alfred Whitehead concluded that everything is just a footnote to Plato.
He imagines that he is a master in dishonesty, able to take every crooked turn and wriggle into and out of every hole, bending like a withy and getting out of the way of justice, and all for what? In order to gain small points, not worth mentioning. He's talking about the lifelong litigant, ladies and gentlemen. 2,700 years ago, the lawyers and the judges were already driving Greek society insane. Okay.
I think one of the most compelling moments in the history of Western thought is in this book. And I will never forget, I still get goosebumps thinking about it, which is the challenge of the Ring of Gyges. If you had this ring, and that's the story in here, and you turned the bezel of the ring and you became invisible, and you could get away with anything by being invisible, would you do it?
What Plato wants to prove in the Republic is that that's wrong, that in fact, even with a ring that made you invisible, even apart from what other people think, it's good to be good. The question is whether he succeeds in proving what others might want him to prove or expect him to prove. In the course of the Republic, he redefines goodness. Plato tells us that virtue is internal to a person, that it's the harmony of the soul.
People leave the dialogue differently from when they start. You are a changed person in some ways by encountering this man who truly means what he says. This is not just highfalutin bull session. This is about life and how you leave it, how you live it, how you leave it, and the conditions under which it should be lived. This is about the real stuff.
You see, most of us, when we think, usually we're in trouble, and we think to get out of trouble. What Plato tries to convey there is thinking can be a feast and a frenzy, and that philosophy is that thinking as a feast.
The wonder, Plato says, is the beginning of philosophy. We're still wondering about the same questions he set down all those centuries ago, searching for wisdom and justice and finding an imperfect approximation, struggling between reality and illusion, reason and passion, politics and philosophy, public and private, body and soul. And probably, we always will be.
Behind every great book, there's a great story. Now, sit back and spend an hour with the best reading experience you'll ever have on television. The Great Books Festival continues on TLC, Adventures for Your Mind.